Hi! I'm going to be talking about buried foreshadowing as a stylistic device in Karen Joy Fowler's book, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, and how to replicate her style. We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves is a Booker Prize nominated book. It came out in 2013. It's a family drama about a woman named Rosemary Cook trying to understand the disappearance of her sister Fern. It's a first-person narrated text, constructed like a memoir, jumping mainly between Rose's early childhood before the accident and immediately after, and her early adulthood once she's moved to college. As a result, for most of the text, Rose is actually actively controlling the reader's perceptions. The premise of the book is that in the late 70s, scientists were raising chimpanzees in human families to see if they were capable of communication and higher level brain function. Fern was one such test subject, which is revealed about a third of the way to the book. Rose repressed her memories of the incident and subconsciously held herself responsible for Fern's disappearance. Usually with foreshadowing, it acts as an inversion of causation, in which an author knows that something is going to happen to a character and decides to signpost that by leaving a clue for the reader to find. So for example, in real life, a person might have gone sailing and see a storm on the horizon, and they can guess that it might result in a shipwreck, but they can't know for sure. In fiction, however, if a writer is obeying Chekhov's gun principle, they will only include the storm on the horizon to show the reader that the character's luck is about to turn. This control over the reader's perspective is a result of the author's surplus of knowledge, in that theoretically they know exactly where the story is going, they have complete control over the fictional universe, so they become this omnipotent and all-knowing being. Foreshadowing in We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves works a little differently. Because Rose is writing the book as a memoir, the only thing she doesn't know is the ending of the story, which happens after the novel finishes. So she's able to actively leave clues for the reader, who is the last person to find out anything. This allows for a great deal of control over the use of foreshadowing. And because by nature of the text, the reader is left with a deficit of information, they're held hostage by the text. They have less power over the construction of the narrative than the subject, which is fascinating. Fowler has a really specific formula that she uses for all her foreshadowing, where she'll have a section of a chapter, talk about a specific topic, then in the last couple of paragraphs of the text, she'll tell an anecdote which supports her point in the section. And in the anecdote, she'll tell you what the story is going to be about. Then she'll tell the story, and at the end, she'll say something that doesn't really fit with the rest of the anecdote, and straight away, she'll link back to the point. So it's a combination of controlled foregrounding of the clue and burying it in either an info dump or a section of dialogue. Just pause here to give this a read. The first example is about familial affection. It's about how great Rose's older brother is. So she tells you, Lowell's really good, he used to be so patient and kind and caring. Then she gives you an example and an insight into their interactions as a trio. Then mentions this little nugget here about equality between a big space monkey, Chewie, and his human friends, Luke and Han. So this isn't exactly an outright piece of evidence. Nobody's going to look at that and go, why exactly does this kid feel so strongly about this? Of course, it's because her sister is a chimpanzee. And of course, straight away, Rose links back to how caring Lowell is. So when you're trying to foreground something, there's a few ways to do it, but the one I'll be focusing on is creating a cycle of expectation and disrupting it. This can be done in a few ways too, but specifically Fowler is using the technique of setting up and disturbing a reader's horizon of expectations of the narrative. So in these little anecdotes, she's telling a reader what to expect pretty outright, basically going, this is a heartwarming tale of brotherly affection. So all the reader is looking for is brotherly affection. In this example, the clue is pretty obviously not fitting in with that narrative. It has no connection to Lowell, Rose, or Fern until Fowler links it back to the theme. This is really subtle. It's a means of hiding a clue in the back of the reader's mind so it fits with the story mostly. It doesn't stick out enough for you to trip over, just enough that you take note of it. And she sticks it at the end of the chapter so you'll immediately focus on something else. It's an illusion. It's like magic where the action's never happening where the magician tells you it is. Pause to read this bit. So in this anecdote, she's talking about the kindness of their neighbours after Fern's disappearance, while her mum was depressed and bedridden and her dad was a mostly functional alcoholic. Pretty depressing stuff. She's spent the whole chapter talking about eating peanut butter bickies for tea and never seeing her mum. So you're all set to hear about the amazing kindness of strangers. But you've also been set up to think about how weird and uncomfortable they are, because Rose throughout the novel has established that she isn't religious and she has serious privacy issues. She hates telling people about her family situation. So the reader is focusing on the Biards, not really on the weird things they're saying. Another thing that Fowler likes to do to distract the reader's attention is to ground her anecdotes in concrete, tactile detail. It works a lot like real memory, where you have this super amplified and subjective version of the truth and maybe a couple of strong images or sensations connected to them. And this brings the reader really close to the story, puts them in the narrator's shoes. So even though there's that really strong disconnect between the reader and the character, which is created by Rose's self-awareness and usually stops the narrator from allowing the reader into their psyche, Rose is still making her story really relatable. This is really fascinating when used in the context of family dramas, because that sense of memory, a rich shared history, that sort of canon of family stories that everyone knows, can be hard to introduce that level of shared knowledge into a reader's subtlety. So this technique is a really useful approach, and it's a really good way to stop the reader from thinking too critically about the story, because sometimes active readers can approach things a bit like a treasure hunt, always thinking about what this symbol could mean and why someone would say such a thing, etc. And that's good. But it's good to have a mix, because it can be really interesting to look at the ways that you can surprise an active reader. So in this example, the focus is more on how to bury foreshadowing in dialogue instead of an info dump. So it's a little different. Pause and give it a read. This is happening in Rose's uni days. She's talking about meeting her best friend's boyfriend and how annoying the both of them can be. But she also mentions something that she quotes pretty much word for word later. The ordinary powers in one world equal extraordinary in another. That's actually something she uses to comfort herself when she thinks about Fern's disappearance, that her ability to use sign language and understand English will be like superpowers when she's surrounded by other chimpanzees. She also uses this to make herself feel better when she's feeling socially isolated because of her monkey-esque behavior. She reminds herself it's not so bad because she has secret superpowers. And in context of the conversation, there were probably better defenses and arguments she could use. That Tarzan has abnormal strength, that his swinging from vines thing is really unrealistic, etc. But Rose sticks with the defense that she uses subconsciously about herself and Fern, and that's very telling. This section is happening in the not-so-distant past. It's a lot less condensed and has more dialogue. It's not quite as subjective, although you still get the narrator giving asides and self-editing. So there's a lot more concrete detail that the reader is dealing with, a lot more information to bury the foreshadowing in. When we're talking about dialogue in fiction, essentially it operates on 3 levels: what the characters are saying, what they actually want out of the conversation, and what they want out of the narrative, their drive. So if you substitute that third layer of subtext with whatever you're foreshadowing, you can use that same technique of moving forward and away from the point of the conversation using conversational gambits and adjacency pairs. It's pretty simple to see here why Rose's dialogue sticks out so much in the conversation. She waits until that moment to speak, doesn't introduce herself or talk about the beer stealing which happens at the beginning, or about the conversation she had with Harlow. So it's further towards the point of the conversation and also the point of her narrative, and it happens at a point where she hasn't engaged with any of the other adjacency pairs. But she's still not jumping up and down and yelling, "My sister was a chimp." So it's, even though she's getting ridiculously defensive about an ape man, it's still subtle. So the reader is getting focused on how rude Reg and Harlow are being, and also about how obstinate Rose is being, and her dialogue and point is foregrounded just enough that the reader goes, "Huh, that's weird," but moves straight along to the minor point of the anecdote again. Here I've done up a table about the sort of various aspects of the technique, and basically the strong points here are that everything comes together to create a realist sense of memory, to prime the reader for a whopper of a realization down the track. And this sense of collapse of time, even though the reader is aware they're reading about an old memory, they still feel like they're caught up in the moment the way that strong memories can do. This is my example text using the same technique of buried foreshadowing. And obviously it works best in long-form fiction once the reader has had time to really process the clue and it's in the very back of their mind, whereas short story, you tend to be an even more active reader than usual. But I'll give you a read. The first time I saw him, it was across a darkened room, hazy with cigarette smoke and drained of colour like something shot on celluloid. He was in a corner booth with his grandfather, nursing a lukewarm, half-drunk VB, long fingers picking unconsciously at the remains of its label. There was a look on his face like he was stuck in traffic with no idea how he got in the car in the first place. He looked helpless, downtrodden, good enough to eat. He took my breath away. When he came up for a refill, I leant against the bar, crossed my arms, looked up at him through my eyelashes, waited for him to make the first move. "Actually, I was wondering if... could I get your number?" he asked, fresh beer in hand, sticker already halfway shredded. My shift ends in 20, I said, even though I was rostered to close. "Want to go for a drive?" His smile settled into place somewhere in the pit of my stomach, warm and unassuming. The only part of this town I really like is the pier, ramshackle and rusted, wood bleached by years of harsh sunlight. We sat on the edge with our toes in the freezing water. He smelt like petrol and fabric softener and held my hand gently, like it was breakable. "What happened after graduation?" I asked him. His fingers flexed convulsively. "Family stuff. What's your excuse?" We both stayed quiet for a moment. Then I sighed. "Don't really care about bits of paper, except prizes, money." He tilted with his head, looked me in the eye for once. Life doesn't give out participation awards, and for a moment I was struck dumb. Then I heaved myself up, legs a little stiff, and started walking back to the car. He said, "Look, I'm sorry, it's just..." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him fiddling with his watch band, sliding it up and down his wrist where it's a little loose. "I just feel so empty," I said quietly. I felt him come up behind me, put a warm hand on my waist. "It's late," I said. "I better get you home." So just have a little read of the last page. So this is just an outline of the foreshadowing I used in the first section, where I've attempted to foreground that idea of M eating Tom, but then bury it in the sappy teen romance of the moment. Using the first line, "across a darkened room," I influence the reader's expectations. They're expecting love at first sight. I'm drawing from an intertextual experience of cringy teen romances that everyone shares, and that observation, that he looks sort of vulnerable and sad rather than gorgeous and confident, disrupts the cycle a little bit, because it's an inversion of the usual power dynamic. So I've also varied the sentence structure a little bit with a short list of adjectives on the clue as opposed to a longer sentence, and I've used foggy signification as a counterpoint to the concrete detail I use earlier in the paragraph. This technique can be used in a specific way for people working with characters who need to discover some shocking secret from their past or point out some subconscious trauma to the reader. To do that subtly requires a lot of control over the direction of the narrative, but it's also useful more in general. It's a really economical use of a word count, where a scene that illuminates a character can also develop the plot subtly. And that sort of delayed realization thing can be really useful in the horror genre, like in The Orphanage, when the mum realizes that she killed her own son, and the banging noises she's been hearing were the desperate attempts to get out of the basement, not ghosts, and you have that stomach-dropping chill. But because the clues were a little bit too subtle and buried for you to notice without it being pointed out, but once you put it together, you go, of course, that's what that meant. Oh, that's horrific. And it can be applicable to any situation where you want to use foreshadowing, essentially, although it does still work best as a mimic of memory. So thank you for your time, and I hope you'll go read We're All Completely Beside Ourselves now that I've spoilt it for you. Thank you.